Welcome, everyone, to our third CRAAV event, Roundtable on Building an Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies program. My name is Yumi Kim. I'm an assistant professor of Japanese and Korean history at Johns Hopkins. I am also one of the co-founders, along with my colleagues here, Erin Chung in political science and Clara Han in anthropology. We started a new initiative that I think many of you in the audience at this point have heard about, an initiative called CRAAV, or Critical Responses to Anti-Asian Violence. We come to you today from Johns Hopkins University, which is located on the traditional unceded lands of the Piscataway and Susquehannock peoples. We recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples on this land, including the Piscataway, Lumbee, Eastern Band of Cherokee, and many other tribes, more than 7,000 of whom currently live in Baltimore City. Within the university, we come from Homewood campus, once known as the Carroll Farm and site of chattel slavery. Together, we acknowledge the history of violence, broken treaties, and ongoing systemic inequities as a first step toward reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge slavery happened on this land, and anti-Blackness continues to happen here every day. We give thanks to the past, present, and future stewards of this land and respect their sovereignty and right to self-determination. Acknowledging these histories of settler colonialism and slavery and tracing how they structure our present lives is a crucial part of this initiative. And we thank each and every one of you for making time to attend our third event of the semester. I know it's an intense time in the semester with an ongoing global pandemic, which makes these conversations taking place here, I think, is especially important and urgent, but at the same time, for many people, harder to find the time and energy to attend. So we thank you. And without further ado, Professor Erin Chung is going to introduce our participants in the roundtable today, and she'll also explain how the format of the roundtable will work.
Thank you so much, Professor Kim, and thank you to the co-sponsors of today's roundtable, the SNF Agora Institute, the Alexander Gross Humanities Institute, the Program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship, and the East Asian Studies Program. And I also want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us today during an especially busy time of the semester, and especially to our speakers too for joining us. So I am really delighted to introduce our panelists today, some of whom I've known for many, many years, and others that I've just met today. So first, I'll begin with Dr. Fariha Khan, who is the co-director of the Asian American Studies program at the University of Pennsylvania, where she also teaches courses on South Asians in the United States, Asian American communities, Asian American food, as well as Muslim identity in America. She received her master's degree in Arabic and Islamic studies from Yale University and a PhD in folklore and folklife from the University of Pennsylvania. Her current research focuses on South Asian American Muslims, Pakistani American culture, and the Asian American folklore. Outside of Penn, Dr. Khan served on the Pennsylvania Governor's Advisory Commission on Asian Pacific Americans from 2015 to 2019, and is currently serving on a number of boards, including the board of the American Folklore Society, the Philadelphia Folklore Project, and the Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival. So welcome, Professor Khan. Next, Professor Heidi Kim is the director of the Asian American Center at UNC Chapel Hill and a professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature. She's the author of Invisible Subjects, Asian Americans in Post-War Literature, which was published in 2016 by Oxford University Press, and which resituates the work of Ralph Ellison, William Faulkner, John Steinbeck, and the Melville Revival critics through recent advances in Asian American studies and historiography. She has a forthcoming book from Temple University Press entitled Illegal Immigrants / Model Minorities, The Cold War of Chinese American Literature, which sheds new light on the writing of and about Chinese Americans who were dogged by the stigma of illegal immigration and paranoia about communist infiltration. And she also researches and speaks extensively on the literature and history of the Japanese American incarceration, including the award-winning edited volume Taken from Paradise Isle, which was published by Colorado University Press in 2015. Welcome, Professor Kim. And finally, Professor Ji-Yeon Yuh is the founding faculty member of the Asian American Studies program at Northwestern University, where she teaches Asian American history, Asian diasporas, race and gender, and oral history. And I also should note she is one of my most cherished mentors. I've known her actually right when I was finishing at Northwestern. Her book, Beyond the Shadow of Camptown, Korean Military Brides in America, was the first substantive work to examine the consequences of US militarism for Korean migration and diaspora, and continues to be cited extensively today. Her current projects include a digital oral history repository focused on Asian diasporas, an oral history project on the Midwest as an Asian American space, a book on Korean diaspora in China, Japan, and the United States, and a study of reunification and Korean peace activism in the Korean diaspora. She has been a consultant for numerous public history, media, and education projects, including Still Presence Past, which is an exhibit on Korean Americans and the Korean War, Crossing East, which is a radio documentary on Asian Americans, and Pollyanna's forthcoming high school racial literacy curriculum. She is a co-founder and former steering committee member of the Alliance of Scholars Concerned About Korea, and currently serves on the boards of Women Cross DMZ and the Korea Policy Institute, among many others. So welcome, Professor Yuh. And just very briefly for the audience, since this is a roundtable discussion, I invite everyone in the audience to post their questions directly through the Q&A function in your Zoom menu at any time. And we especially invite you to turn on your camera and or your mic to ask your questions directly by indicating your preference in the Q&A box. And we can also just make you allow that function to happen automatically when we read your question so that you can ask any follow-up questions as well. So with no further ado, I'm going to just get our discussion started. And I was wondering if each of you could tell us a little bit about the Asian American Studies program at your institution and how you came to be director there. So why don't we start with Professor Khan?
Sure. Well, first I just wanted to say thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation. It's really wonderful to be with all of you. I'm looking forward to learning as much as I can offer as well. And I look forward to all of the audience questions as well. I hope that will be, it can be as interactive as possible. So the University of Pennsylvania is Asian American Studies program is celebrating 25 years this academic year. The program was born out of student struggle, like probably many other programs. It really stemmed from undergraduates and graduate students demanding recognition of their histories. There is a flyer that they posted that I have in my archive of our curriculum book at that time that had a hole in it. And many of those flyers said, our curriculum at Penn has a hole in it. We are missing any kind of course on the Asian American experience, right? And so that program has grown, but we still remain a vibrant program, but it's small. We have limited faculty. We also have only a minor. Many things has changed this particular year, which I can talk about later as well, that has put us, I think, hopefully on a path of growth. how I became co-director is really sort of by chance. I was a graduate student, and the associate director at the time had gotten another job offer and they needed someone to fill in. I was a grad student, so they asked me if I could just please answer the phone. And I said, well, if I answer the phone, I need to have an office because I'm finishing my dissertation. And so Professor Grace Cow, who was director at the time, said, sure, you can sit in there and answer the phone and we'll, would you mind working here for 20 hours a week? And I said, okay, I'll work there for 20 hours a week because that's all we were allowed to work as grad students. And, that was 2007. And here we are. She hired me, and here we are. It's 2021. So it was a little bit per chance that happened, but it's been wonderful.
Thank you so much, Professor Khan. Professor Kim, could I ask you to answer the same question?
Hi, everyone. I'm so impressed by this initiative, and I'm so happy to be here to support your own investigation into the possibility of program building on your campus. I think of the three of us, I'm in a slightly different position. I direct a center, which means it's not a curricular unit. We are actually not within the college. Technically, we are in the office of the provost, and all these things make a difference administratively on a large campus. So we are in academic affairs, being in the office of the provost, and we have a mission to serve the entire university as well as the entire state, because the state mission is very important to UNC as state university. So the center is actually only a little over a year old. So we officially opened during the pandemic. And this laptop that I'm using to speak to you was pretty much the Asian American Center last year. At least that's how it felt. Now we have a building and we have one full-time staff person, Dr. Krupal Amin, who's wonderful. And so we're able to do in-person events and so on. But it's been very important to me that the center not just be about one-off events, but that we also create programs of research and in-depth projects where students can really get the kind of sustained academic and community engagement that they want and that they really need in order to fully develop their interests. We have a couple of central tensions, and I'm sure we'll go into this more in the course of this roundtable. One is that we are a center, but we are, again, in academic affairs. There is no Asian American or multicultural student center. UNC kind of hopped over that phase of development. And so we do find ourselves in the position of trying to do a lot of things for students to help on the student affairs side while maintaining the academic mission that we're supposed to be fulfilling. The other tension is that, again, we're not a curricular unit. There is no Asian American Studies curricular unit at our university, and there are extremely few faculty. So as to the question of how I became director, I'm sure it was because of my brilliant scholarship and my witty personality, but also I have to tell you, the bench isn't deep. And I think the whole time I was on the provost committee to develop the Asian American Center. And I think the whole time I knew what was coming. And I think we all knew what was coming just because of the lack of Asian American Studies faculty on our campus. So those, I think, are two of our biggest challenges. And they also really have shaped not just me becoming director, but how the center has developed over this past year.
Thank you so much, Professor Kim. And finally, I'd like to invite Professor Yuh to make some comments.
Yeah. So at Northwestern, it really goes back at least to 1995, when undergraduate students became fed up with trying to negotiate with the university in their push for an Asian American Studies program. And they staged a hunger strike in April of that year, in the spring quarter. that was an interesting spring in the Midwest and the East Coast for Asian American students and for their allies, because it wasn't just at Northwestern that students staged a action. Students at Columbia and Princeton also staged actions. Right? At Northwestern, the consequence of that was that 4 years later, almost to the day, in the spring of 1999, the evening before I was to defend my dissertation, I received a call from the dean saying, "We're offering you the job." Right? So I want you guys to think about that for a moment, because for me at that time, I didn't understand what that really meant. I was just like, oh my God, I have a job, thank God, right? But how could a university hire somebody who was only, a month or two about to get her degree to build a curricular unit from scratch, like literally from scratch? There was nobody there. There was no staff. There was no curriculum, right? It's like hiring a baby to drive a truck, right? Who would do that? Who would do that? The reason Northwestern did that, I would say a couple of things. One is no commitment. You hire an assistant professor, they fail, you can deny them tenure, send them on their way, right? So just send them packing. And Northwestern had already tried to hire senior people to build a program, right? Because the students had wanted it, it was a big deal. But none of the senior people came. And they didn't come because Northwestern refused to give them the kind of resources that are actually necessary to build a program, right? So more than one staff person, right? A decent budget, additional faculty lines, right? All kinds of things that are necessary. None of that, right? Nevertheless, because I was hired to build this program from scratch, I spent the next 6 weeks basically negotiating with the dean's office over exactly that: staff, budget, and faculty lines. Okay? And so what we managed to do was we were promised space, we were promised a staff person, we were promised work study students, and I was promised at least 2 more faculty lines to be hired over the next 5 years. Right? That's not enough, but it's what we had. Right? So from that, what we have now is we have a major and a minor. We have, how many faculty do we have? We have 5 faculty. Right? Last year, we hired our very first faculty wholly in Asian American studies, not in partnership with a tenure home, because we finally managed to convince the university, look, all the best people are interdisciplinary and none of the departments want them because they're not trained in anthropology or sociology or poli-sci or history or English. And so we're losing the best people. Okay? And we have had a long time collaboration with Latina and Latino studies on campus. And so the university, and they were having the same problem, right? So the university said, okay, you guys can put together a kind of council for race and ethnic studies that will be the tenure home for new faculty in your 2 programs. And so that's what we have. It's a big advance. How did that advance come about? It wasn't just because we said we need this. It was because actually the students from both programs collaborated, created what they called a Latinx and Asian American student collective. And they protested and had a big alumni petition, and they agitated for departmentalization for each of the units. And with that, the administration probably thought, well, we don't want to have departments of this. We don't want them to stay as small, lowly programs, but we will give them this bone, this ability to tenure. And hopefully that will get them off our back.
Erin, I'd just like to say that I was a grad student at Northwestern. And Ji-Yeon was also my mentor. I didn't know she was also one of yours. And I really watched that program be built. I learned from the best. And it takes so much faculty sacrifice. I mean, Ji-Yeon put so much of herself into that program. And I think that's a real cost of program building, particularly when they're under-resourced. I mean, to be thrown into that position right out of graduate school, when in a perfect world, especially at a research-focused institution at Northwestern, your junior faculty might be protected just a little bit to write their book, to make sure that they could get tenure. You know, that is a really huge ask. And sometimes I think I just still look at it with such admiration. And I also want to third that we have this common note of student advocacy and protest. So, you know, the UNC Asian American Center is very new. We don't come out of that same generation of student protest, but over the last 7 years, I would say, I really watched and worked with students who were advocating for different things. For quite a while, actually, students were advocating for faculty lines and for some kind of academic program. That was something that was really advocated for, in particular, under our last chancellor. And likewise, on the faculty side, a colleague of mine and I wrote our own self-study and turned it into the administration to kind of show what strengths we had and what demand there was and how much we needed. And the shift to advocating for a center was rather quick. And it came out of, I think, other student leadership and also alumni who joined. And to be honest, that financial support was absolutely essential as well. But definitely the student voice, and in particular, the undergraduate student voice, is just essential. I mean, much as faculty had been advocating, negotiating, asking for years, the headway that students make is just nothing. You know, it's beyond anything I think that faculty can produce, certainly at my institution.
To add to what Heidi is saying about that, the difference between faculty voice and student voice is really a difference in the relationship with the university and a difference of money. Students are potential alumni and potential donors, future donors. Faculty are employees, salaried employees, right? It's very different. And so the university will listen to student voices in a way that they don't listen to faculty voices. Even though the university also waits out students and thinks, oh, 4 or 5 years, generation changes, the issue will go away. Nevertheless, they give the students a kind of respect in some ways that they don't give to faculty.
I'd like to just add to, you know, we've had several protests throughout my time at Penn, and I think our latest protest was slightly different because while we had a petition that was written by students, current undergrad students, I think the piece that was very different this time was we had a lot of alumni support. And that made a huge difference because it got to the point, I think, you know, when our budget was cut and students protested, when Professor Cow left and that line was not kept, right? There were no promises for that. They didn't offer anything to us. I think they began to just ignore students, right? Because it's just, oh, here's another, you know, complaint from Asian American Studies, you know, here these students want to come and meet with us again. I think it was different this time because it was, you know, really alumni driven, and that served as a bit of a wake-up call for the administration that there are wealthy donors or potentially wealthy donors that are very upset with some of the decision making, you know, that's going on.
I do think it's remarkable, in hearing your stories, that all three of you were so junior when you were asked to, like, as Professor Yuh mentioned, was asked to build and direct this in these programs, right? And I, it is very concerning that what the implications are, right, in terms of what this says about the administration's kind of value of of this program, right? But I'd like to follow up a bit about the role of student demand before, and certainly I'd like to follow up about the role of alumni too. But I wonder, what demands that your students made at your university were actually met, and which ones were unmet.
I'm happy to begin. For our students, I think throughout the 25 years, it's, like Professor Yuh and Professor Kim, I think it's the same set of demands, right? It's more faculty, more funding for the program, increased staff administrative support, and space. I think those are probably the key pieces. Really, for a long time, none of which we had at Penn, right? Which is a university that, has a massive endowment, So it's very frustrating. Things have changed for us in the past year. And what I would say that it was certainly the demands of the students in terms of getting these particular asks of having more faculty, having more support. But it was also the pandemic and the anti-Asian violence, right? And so all of these things sort of came together at this particular moment. So it was the student demands, it was the anti-Asian violence, it was yet another professor potentially not being retained in Asian American studies, right? So now the loss of, we had 4 standing faculty, it was coming down to 3, and now potentially could only be 2 standing faculty. And then Atlanta, right? And so I have to acknowledge that particular moment of violence, right, ended up in the administration suddenly saying, hey, we're going to do a cluster hire for Asian American studies. And so what resulted are actually 3 lines, tenure track lines, that will happen at Penn in sociology, in English, and in history, which is incredibly exciting. But would that have happened if those other factors weren't there and it was just student demand? And so it's painful to say that probably not, right? I think the university was in a very difficult position and did not want this to become larger. And so that was the outcome. We additionally received full-time administrative support and, additional funding. So all of that is, those demands have been met, and it's very positive, and it's exciting to think about the growth, but I'm never in a moment without knowing how this happened.
So I also just want to briefly mention that one of our audience members, Calvin Wong, actually asked that very question about how significantly did your institution support for your program change after the COVID-19 anti-Asian violence began. And he also writes that he appreciates the place of student activism in validating interests, and to what degree did students or alumni receive information from your units to direct their activism. So I'm just going to actually make Calvin temporarily a panelist if you want to follow up with any of your questions, but please feel free to incorporate those questions as well into your answers. So please go ahead.
So in terms of the original question about what demands were met and what demands were not met, the story of the Asian American Center is a very triumphant one, because it was a relatively short campaign to ask for center, and we got a center, and it opened, and there I was with my laptop. So we had a center. But I think that taking the longer view and having been here long enough to see different asks from students, the ask that was consistently not granted was around faculty. And that was an ask that wasn't only coming from students. And I recall some students who went and got a meeting with our then chancellor. They came back and they wanted to kind of debrief with me. So this touches on Calvin's question of how much information was going back and forth. You know, there was always a lot of conversation. I think that was really important. But they wanted to debrief with me, and they said, you know, the chancellor asked us, well, you know, would you rather have Asian American Studies faculty, or would you rather have more mental health support for Asian American students? And they were a little bit befuddled by this. And I said, yes, you were supposed to be, right? Because this false choice was held out to you to try to essentially knock you off of the course that you were pursuing, in my opinion. And I will be very frank, the Atlanta shootings, I'm sure for many people on this call, I don't need to describe what that period was like afterwards. You know, the responsibility, the emails, the questions, trying to emotionally support the whole community. And I tried to use that moment to again make this ask for faculty that has continually not been fulfilled. And I didn't, unfortunately, have full time and energy to give to it. But I can tell you I got nowhere. That is just the truth. I got a lot of expressions of personal support, but no actual commitments. And I think that is my very diplomatic way of putting it. And so that really, it has been the stone wall at my institution. And I think that, you know, centers and non-curricular programs, sometimes there just is more flexibility. I think that there was precedent because we had opened a Latinx center fairly recently. So that kind of softened that direction. We do have a Latinx studies program, but it's founded a while ago, and there had been a little bit of a critical mass of faculty first, whereas here we're in this weird position where we don't have the critical mass of faculty. And so building the program requires hiring the faculty. So honestly, I keep talking, and I'm kind of hoping for that next wave of student activism to help me out, because I think right now a lot of the focus is on the center, rightly. And so perhaps we need another wave. But certainly I would say throughout all these different waves, asking for different things, including a most recent wave that did ask for Asian American focused mental health support, which was successful. There's always been really good communication among the faculty and the staff and the students, and now also the alumni. So in answer to Calvin's question, I think that is really key.
So similarly at Northwestern, the big ask that is routinely denied is for faculty, right? So the program began in 1999 with 3 faculty lines. And it was not until 3 years ago that a 4th faculty line was made available, right? And that's the line in which we hired, you know, an assistant professor in Asian American Studies to be tenured in Asian American Studies without a department involved. Okay, so and the only reason that we have 5 tenure-track faculty with those 4 lines is because one of those lines was split between 2 departments, right? Anthropology and African American Studies. They both put forward half of a line from retiring faculty, so that in a search that we had for 1 person, we were able to hire 2 people. Okay? And that's actually fairly unusual. It's not common, but you know, a lot of that had to do with sort of the circumstances of departmental support for those particular candidates, right? But also, I think it points to the fact that from the beginning, Asian American Studies at Northwestern had widespread collaborative support, right? So that 1995 hunger strike is seen as an Asian American student hunger strike. And yes, the hunger strikers were Asian American students, but the coalition behind them was a multiracial, multiple student organization coalition, from the queer student organization to the African American students to like everybody, right? And you know, in the first years of building that program, my strongest and most knowledgeable allies in the faculty were invariably African American Studies faculty, whether they were in English or in theater or in sociology or in the AFM department or in poli-sci. Like Professor Chung, your mentor in political science, was an amazing ally and supporter of Asian American Studies. And that's really important, right? So African American Studies was established in Northwestern also on the heels of a big student action in the early 1970s. And those faculty really helped Asian American Studies program be established in the late, 20 years ago, 23 years ago. And then, we also, right, African American Studies faculty and Asian American Studies faculty also are supported the development of a Latina and Latino Studies program, okay, which happened like 15 years ago. And then also now supporting the development of a Native American and Indigenous Studies program, which doesn't exist yet. The faculty have been hired, and so that's the next step. At every step, there was this kind of collaboration, not only among faculty, but also among students, right, which I think is just really important. One more thing I want to say about that is, look at how the administration dribbles it out, right? Because they're really dragging their heels. They don't really want any of this, right? They're dragging their heels, and they're only doing it little by little, dribble by dribble, dribs and drabs, when they have to, when they can't get away from it, right? When their rhetoric of diversity, equity, and inclusion is so far away from the reality that they're forced to do something, right, to bridge that gap, or at least to appear to be bridging that gap. And I think that remains one of the biggest challenges, right? That actual racial equity, actual diversity and inclusion and equity is something that is marginalized, right? And it's used as propaganda, as self-promotion for the university, something to gloss over the reality, rather than there being a really genuine effort to develop and create and foster an actual university culture of diversity and equity.
I just want to follow up, Professor Yuh, because I could not agree more. And in sort of to respond to that, and to respond to Calvin's particular question around how is information shared. So from Asian American Studies, we shared information as we received it. We received almost no information. But what was quite telling to me, and I think is indicative of what Professor Yuh was saying about the administration, when they decided to have this cluster hire, they called the director, the then director, informed her that they were moving forward with this. It was probably about a 4-minute call. And then the announcement went out. The announcement actually was not on Penn's website. It was on, you have to go through Penn's website to get to the School of Arts and Sciences. And there were 3 sentences at the bottom of the homepage of the School of Arts and Sciences, which I'm not sure how many people visit that a day, probably 5. Right? I mean, no one is seeing this. So, they were also faced with a petition that had over 800 signatures and comments. Students and alums wrote comments, detailed comments about their experiences, about the faculty, about the courses that they took. There was no response to the alums. There were no response or any communication to the undergraduate students. And other than that, tiny little 3 sentences, on the bottom of an obscure website page. So that to me indicates there really wasn't a desire to move this forward, right? It was a matter of circumstances that they didn't, they had to deal with it, and this was the best way. Did they really want it or understand its implications? No.
So there's a follow-up question that that it was posted anonymously by an attendee is, why do you think the administration is so reluctant to adopt an Asian American Studies program? Is it mostly just a financial issue?
It is not a financial issue. We're talking about Penn, Northwestern, Harvard, and Yale, for example, which have billions of dollars in endowment. Northwestern recently finished a major fundraising campaign that went something like 30 to 40% over its fundraising goal. Okay, so these are wealthy institutions. They have the money. Right? The problem is these institutions are fundamentally white supremacist, white nationalist organizations. Okay? Politely, we call them PWIs, primarily white institutions, right? But really, they are white supremacist institutions, right? These were institutions created by white men for the benefit of other wealthy white men like themselves. So it's not just white even, it's also about class, it's also about gender, right? Ethnic studies and Asian American studies are areas of intellectual endeavor and inquiry that is committed to opposing white supremacy. So why would a white supremacist institution actually want to have us, or African American studies, or Indigenous studies, or Latinx studies, right? All of these ethnic studies disciplines, their premise is resisting and opposing and so just revealing the realities of white supremacy, and also showing the ways in which people of color have thrived despite white supremacy. Okay? So we go against their very foundational character. So of course they don't want us. Okay? And that it also ties back to white Americans sort of agonizing over the quote unquote browning of America, right? That America is going to become a majority minority country demographically. And what does that mean, right? It's also tied to the ways in which voter suppression is sweeping the country, right? When, the Republicans, for example, have realized that, wow, we are about to have a multiracial democracy on our hands. It's not just white people who are the primary voters these days, right? Well, we can't have a multiracial democracy. That's not what America's about. America is about a democracy of white people, right? You know, origins are really important, right? America began as a white supremacist country in which the only people allowed the vote were white men with property, right? And white supremacy is not just about race, it's also about class and also about gender, right? And although we have, 300 years of people of color and women of color, et cetera, all agitating for greater democracy, greater rights, et cetera, the realities of the United States as being at its core a white supremacist country has not gone away. And that this is a country that institutions like colleges like ours were created to maintain, not to oppose, not to question, but to maintain.
So when I was hired, unlike Ji-Yeon, I wasn't asked to build a program. I was explicitly told when I was interviewed that if I wanted a program, I could go raise the money for one myself. I hadn't asked. They just put that out there to forestall in case I was going to ask the question. That didn't mean, by the way, that I was going to get development officer support if I wanted to do it, right? Because of course, that's a whole separate conversation. And I think that, for me at UNC, that was the starting point, right? That was the way I came in, was with that message. And so everything kind of went counter to that, that I've been trying to build. I think that there's a lot of that what Ji-Yeon is saying is, of course, correct. And that there's a lot of kind of chaff that gets thrown in the air that is sort of part of that network of thinking. So one side of it is the finances. Another side is sort of the whataboutism, right? Oh, if we have an Asian American Studies program, then the floodgates will open, and we have to have a program for this ethnicity and this ethnicity and this race and this race, right? Again, I didn't ask that question, right? But it's these kinds of excuses are put forward. I think that I'm in a state with a political climate that administrators are very much bound by. Ji-Yeon and Freya are at private institutions, but I think that's a huge issue for us. Also, I'm in the South, and the black-white binary is still very crushing. So those are all additional factors that we have that, again, these are not in any way contradicting what Ji-Yeon said, but just sort of specific facets of that essential problem that you have to tackle at different times when you're having this conversation over and over and over.
I think I certainly agree as well, 100%. But there's also part of me that thinks, the administration that is here, which is largely white, largely male, doesn't even care to see us, right? And so there's a part where, yes, we don't want you to have too much power. We're not going to share this space. We're white supremacists, but part of it is like, who are you even, right? And the lack of acknowledgement, right? The invisibility that's placed upon, and at Penn, it's 20 to 25% of the population is Asian or Asian American, right? To not be seen even, right, as even part of the conversation on equity, is significant as well, right? So I don't even know that our administration even cares that much to really think that we're a problem.
Go ahead.
Could I just, I mean, I just wanted to kind of ask a little bit about like shifting it off of the university, which I mean is entangled with the university, but the problem of knowledge production in relation to these fields. And, you know, one of the issues that I think, you know, our initiative is also contending with, which is very much linked into these questions of how do we think across like, you know, trans-Pacific, different, you know, transnational, Asian American, Asian like diaspora, is really the issue around, you know, how these very kind of forces of what we might call white supremacy actually create certain forms of knowledge and boundaries around knowledge that completely suppress other problems, right? Knowledge problems. And I'm just wondering, how do you see your programs addressing breaking open those boundaries or creating new forms of knowledge or new spaces for knowledge production that would challenge, like, for example, the siloing of certain disciplines off of each other, or an area studies model approach?
Yeah, that's a real challenge. It's such a good question. And I think that sometimes there are moments where those conversations move forward. After the Atlanta shootings was maybe one of those, right? Just because of the pressure and the high visibility. And I want to believe some of the actual shock and, you know, horror that people felt genuinely contributed to this spurt of discussion. And so certainly in the weeks after the Atlanta shooting, I was getting outreach from all kinds of units on campus that I hadn't before, and that it would have taken me a long time to kind of build up to partnerships with all of those different units. Units in the health sciences, right? Just again, places that I wouldn't have expected. The challenge has been how to try to keep those dialogues going, and how also to move them within those units out of their diversity spaces. So I noticed that when I was getting those outreaches, it was always that particular unit's, you know, dean of diversity or whatever their title might be, and not from their academic affairs, not from their director of graduate studies or whoever. So it is really difficult. And I think, again, for a center that's in academic affairs, right, we also are in that balance of how do we not just be seen as a diversity initiative, right? How do we get our academic mission taken seriously? And that's part of why I'm so intent on these strategic campus partnerships and these long-term projects that really show a form of knowledge production. But at the same time, I mean, Clara, again, you're 100% right. I don't want to fall in the trap of saying that I have to replicate the existing structure in order to be validated, right? I want to empower students to go off and do other kinds of projects, do community-focused projects and advocacy-focused projects within, of course, the legal limits of what I'm allowed to do as part of a public university, I hasten to add. But I really want to kind of open up those alternative spaces. But at the same time, you know, to be totally frank, again, I am using every ounce of capital that I have earned on my way to becoming a full professor for this center. I am calling on every single relationship and partnership I've built up over 11 years. And so to some extent, I'm depending on, right, those structures. And I've been a really good student, right? Ji-Yeon was a very good professor. And I've written my books, right? I've been validated by really good presses, etc. And so I'm using those tools, but I'm also conscious, right? I keep hearing Audre Lorde that I'm never gonna tear down the master's house with the master's tools. So I wish I had a really complete strategic answer for you there. But all I can say is that for now, what I'm doing is, I suppose, using the master's tools to try to open up spaces for other people. And I do believe, there's a theorist called who writes under the name La Paperson, and I do believe, in line with what they write, that a third university is possible, that we can open up these spaces in universities where we can give our students room to do this kind of revolutionary work. I hope so, anyway.
Yeah, adding to what Heidi is saying, I agree very much, right? It's not just the institutions, right? As Clara Hahn is pointing out, it's our knowledge that has been created and constructed to serve the interests of basically white supremacist nation states and white supremacist empires, right? And so then here we are, who, many of us, we are here in this particular position in the United States, in the Americas, because of white supremacy, because of empire, because of nation states, who, created the historical flows and the politics and economics that brought us here, right? So how do we counter that, right? There's no good answer, but for us at Northwestern, what we are, well, at least what I am intentionally doing, is thinking about, well, what kind of knowledge do our students need? What kind of experiences do our students need to be able to live in this world as something other than an oppressed minority asking for crumbs, right? And what do our communities need from us, right? Not just more interns and, events that are for them and that kind of stuff, but what do our communities need? What kind of knowledge production could be useful to our communities? That's also a double-edged sword too, because there's a form of knowledge for communities that is very colonial, right? Like, we study you guys that we can help you deal with obesity in your communities, diabetes in your communities, addiction in your communities, poverty in your community, everything that you're lacking, we're going to study ways to help you overcome. Not that kind of knowledge production, but the kind of knowledge production that's like, okay, what do the communities need for self-empowerment, right? Not empowerment that, like, somebody more privileged gives them or opens doors for them, but empowerment that they can do themselves, right, where they are. I don't have the answers for that, but I think that intentionally seeking those answers and trying to figure out what that is, and just sort of sitting with communities and hearing what they have to say, right? And also recognizing that when we talk about communities, it's not like they're monolithic, right? They're fractured, they're divisive, they have competing interests. They're some of them are conservative, right? And really don't fit all that well with the ethos of, ethnic studies. But still, we have to figure out, how do we build some kind of a relationship with them? Because it's from that we can figure out and move toward constructing and building and producing knowledge that is not, that doesn't come from the white supremacists, doesn't come from, racist kinds of origins.
I think it's a really important question, Professor Hahn. I'm glad that you're asking it, and I don't know that there's a one answer or that there's an easy answer. I do a lot of work with the Philadelphia Asian American community, various community organizations, and while there is a desire always with various colleagues to do work with the community, the reality is many of our community organizations are at capacity. They are dealing with so much, given the pandemic, given massive slashes in their budget, right? illness, all of these different competing issues that these organizations are confronting, they really don't have time for some Penn student to come in and say, I have a research project, which I will not allow at all, right? But, there are other ways to think about this too, right? And so at Penn, I've been very fortunate. I have amazing colleagues in various departments, and there's a lot of collaborative work through seminars, through courses and so forth. So that's one opportunity to have engagement across disciplines and across communities, right? The university also offers these particular courses, which are called ABCS courses, which are academically based community service courses. And those are really wonderful opportunities because they're within particular communities, oftentimes within the Philadelphia School District, where students can, actually serve a need, right? It's pretty defined. The work is very specific, and students can enroll in that course and actually be useful, right? Instead of having the organization babysit so that they can get an A on their paper, right? But I've also been thinking a lot about this. And so in the spring, I'm teaching a new course, which is going to be called American Race, A Philadelphia Story. And so I really wanted to explore race, for example, without saying, this is the Black problem, this is the Latinx problem, and here are the, these are the issues that the Asians are dealing with. And so it's really going to begin to think about particular themes, right? Issues. For example, 1 week will be on food, 1 week will be on incarceration, right? And then looking at that theme, I'm hoping that students can begin to complicate their understandings of race across communities, right? And begin to think about these issues as impacting all Americans, right? Not just the immigrants, not just the people of color, but this is an issue in our country that, can be examined through various disciplines, through various lenses, and to see how it impacts different community organizations. So as we do those readings, then I hope to also invite local community activists that are actually doing this work, right? So that we're not just sitting in a classroom doing a bunch of readings, but we get to hear how some of these questions are being played out in the city where, many of these students are making their home.
So I think Professor Yumi Kim wanted to ask a question, right?
Oh, well, actually, I was thinking if we could bring in Chris Nealon, if
Done.
okay. I mean, I had more. I had more of a comment really than a question. One just tiny comment from. Actually, now it's been quite a bit of time, but I really appreciated, Professor Yuh, what you said about the way in which the university and the administration sees students as potential donors versus the way they see faculty as employees. Because at Hopkins, among the students here, it's been interesting to see how many of the students who came to me and other faculty, especially, I mean, of course, in the wake of COVID-19 related anti-Asian violence, but especially after Atlanta, they expressed to us just how invisible they feel or how sort of, disempowered they feel. And so they didn't understand it when we said, well, actually, though, we as faculty can't do anything unless you all get loud and busy and make noise. And so it took a while. And I'm pretty sure that this still has not been communicated as forcefully as it could be. But I think part of it is that, in terms of, and I think the question about, well, why aren't universities funding Asian American or Asian diaspora or, Latinx programs? Is it a money issue? And you responded with, well, no, it's not. It's a white supremacy issue. I think a part of it is that students come in with a very romanticized view of what their college experience is going to be like. I mean, they've been sort of fed all those images and ideas, throughout their entire education in secondary schools. And so they come in, and in thinking about trying to build an Asian American or Asian diaspora studies program, it's actually, for many of them, their first encounter with really working through and trying to deconstruct what their own education was grounded in up until this point. And so I think this isn't just, like, oh, how can we most effectively build a program? It's actually, I think much of it has to do also with students working through really difficult, complex, traumatic experiences in their own lives that they are processing as they're thinking about, well, what do I want? Why do I want to major? Why do I want to minor in Asian American Studies program? So that's just one brief comment. And the question also about, Clara's question about knowledge production and the ways in which we're siloed. I mean, I don't even need to tell this group of people. I'm junior. I'm trying to write my book, trying to get tenure. And the ways in which I have to make myself legible to a particular discipline, right, to a particular field with it. I mean, it's not even a divide between Asian studies and Asian American studies. I mean, I was trained in what I learned to call the Japan field, which is, like an area studies derived field, but like with its own sort of particular constellation. But but the thing is, so my position is one in which I'm supposed to teach Japanese history. All the students ask me for Korean history. They ask me for Asian American history. And I tell them, you can't just pick any Asian person off the street who happens to teach Asian history and ask them to teach these other things too. That's actually a very offensive thing for that field of expertise. And so I think part of, in thinking about knowledge production, it really comes down to very concrete questions of who is doing the work, who is laboring. It's usually women. It's usually, faculty of color. And I can totally see the ways in which this could just I can see the ways in which I could not write my book, right? Because there is so much work to be done. And it does often fall on, as was the case for all three of you, junior women faculty of color. I'll stop there because I do want to get to our next question because I think I know that I wanted to respond in part to it.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having this event. And I've learned a ton already. I think, so I won't stumble too much. I'll just read what I wrote, if that's okay. So, my department, English, is currently running an open rank search in Asian American literature, and I'm the director of that committee. We've got a really excellent pool of applicants, but, we have no current faculty in the field, and we've never hired in it before or staffed it before. So as you can imagine, I'm wondering, and I know my colleagues are, we're wondering how best to recruit the scholar to whom we'll eventually offer the position. And so, for Hopkins folks on the call, I'm curious about what you'd want us in English to communicate to a candidate or do during recruitment that would encourage them to join us here. And for others, in a more general way, I'd be grateful for thoughts you might have about how we as a department can act responsibly in a context, responsibly to that person in a context where Asian American studies is still comparatively small, and where there's not currently a cluster hire initiative. So I also realized that some of the answers to that question might be different if the person we end up making an offer to is a junior person or a senior person. But I see tonight's gathering as just a really nice opportunity to get some expert thoughts on that. So thank you.
There's really no good way to do that when your department doesn't have anybody who does Asian American literature, right? So you're going to have to rely on either the kindness of people outside your department, outside your institution, who you know are Asian American studies scholars, who might, be able to help you out a little bit. Or, and I kind of hate to say this, but relying on certain kinds of tried and true gatekeeping strategies. Does the person have an advisor who is known as an Asian American literature scholar? If they're senior, has that person been in core faculty of recognized Asian American studies programs? Right? Does that person publish in recognized Asian American studies journals? And does that person attend and is active in the Association for Asian American Studies? Right? Lacking expertise to figure out whether somebody actually is an Asian American Studies scholar or not, without that kind of gatekeeping sort of, rubric, it's kind of what you have to rely on.
Thank you.
I would also, go ahead, Heidi.
No, go ahead, Faria.
No, I just was going to say very, very quickly is that the second part of the question also might be, how will you get them to stay?
Yes.
Right? So yeah, maybe you can offer them XYZ and they come. How will you get them to stay and to make significant contributions to the university, to the department, and to the field while they're there? And that might be something that you and your colleagues really think through as well, particularly if there is no one else in the department.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I think that, this is a very super simple answer, but they want the same things that anyone else wants in recruitment, right? They want great colleagues, great students, and most importantly, they want to be seen and valued and supported for the things that they value in their career. So, I think that in a position like this, if somebody comes and all the questions are about teaching and program building, they might not feel valued as a researcher, right? So it's that kind of, I think, thing, especially again, as this roundtable has clearly shown, where there are high service expectations. I think having a department that is welcoming and also that shows it's really committed to this position and really supports the research and the intellectual life of this person and sees that as an integral part of the department. I think that's very important, right? Not just that, we're going to tenure you or whatever, let's say it's a junior person, but that you are part of our departmental life and we see what you do as fundamental to the way we teach English at this university. And I think that is incredibly important, especially in a smaller department and one where, you're not going to have tons of colleagues in every single field.
It's just a wonderful answer. Thank you.
I just chime in on that, on Heidi's point here about, I think what's really also very important is, in these small departments, but actually small or large, actually, that the faculty who is studying what is then bounded as Asian America or Asian American literature is not kind of siloed off into producing knowledge on Asian American literature. That is to say, you're taking literature, right? You're saying the scholar is saying something about literature as such, about genre as such. Like it's not like when I study something on, for example, the police state, I'm not talking about the Chilean police state. I'm not talking about, if I talk about disease, I'm not talking about Korean disease, I'm talking about disease through the specificity of working on questions in a context. And so I think the one of the issues becomes, and I think it's very, very subtle, how this happens, because it happens in people's comments. It's like, well, so you must know a lot about Asian Americans, so this is saying a lot about Asian America. It's like, no, actually the scholar is also saying something about how we study literature. It pushes method, it pushes our concepts. And so I just think, I think that this is the, there's a certain way in which, the kind of racism happens in knowledge production, and the kind of creation of an inferior tradition, if you will, in which a so-called universal tradition is the master, which is this big kind of, the Christian world, right? So, but it really is. I mean, like, we see this over and over, like in, for example, world literature, like world religions, like, and over again, where the universal is always held up, and it's like everyone else is like put on that standard. And that is, good scholars, serious scholars are the ones that can smell that a mile away. And if they start to perceive that in a job search, they're not going to allow themselves to be recruited there. So I would just be really like, with these recruitments, like really trying to say, like, how do you think through the problem of genre? Like, let me look at your case material. Like, how are you thinking through, like really engaging the project, and then kind of thinking about the transverse connections. And again, like what Ji-Yeon was saying, like, you're gonna have to rely on people that essentially you may not have the, within the department, may not have the kind of, knowledge to help mentor, some of these. I mean, you may actually, because you may be actually doing these transverse connections, but in terms of like actual engagement with specific kind of bodies of literature, you might really not be able to do that. And so getting help from colleagues outside the department is going to be really crucial, especially when it comes to tenuring. If it is a junior, like that's going to be key.
I mean, along those lines, Chris, I wonder if, I mean, I'm not trained as an Asian Americanist, but I wouldn't actually assume that an incoming Asian American literature specialist would want to be surrounded, or that they would prioritize having other faculty from their field in the department. Because, what I know anyway of Asian American studies right now in this moment, it is becoming a deeply transnational field. It is, and transnational, I mean, I'm really just in a rigorous way. And so I don't mean to, I'm very invested in you guys finding a really great person. And so I don't mean to toot our own horn, but I mean, people like, okay, so sometimes what an applicant or a candidate will see from, say, scrolling through the web pages, they see like the names of departments and like, Aaron Chung is political, professor of such and such, or, Clara Han is this, Yumi Kim does this. But this goes precisely back to the question of knowledge production and the disciplines, that create boundaries around that knowledge production. Because if you in fact look at the kind of work that Clara, Aaron, I, and many others do, I think we are in conversation with, what an Asian American literature scholar would be interested in, not necessarily just because we're, interested in questions of, like iterations of Asia, but for other reasons too. And so I think one way to get to the question of, well, how do you recruit someone? I completely agree with Heidi that, you got to show, like we just have to show that there are great people here, and that there are people who can help the sort of, the intellectual development of that person's current project, like especially if they're junior. And I think showing how both within the English department, as Clara was saying, but also outside the department, there is an intellectual community here that is very committed to Asian American literature, and is very invested in it. And so in some ways, we just have to make sure that the candidates get to talk to the right people.
And just to add to that a bit, you know, on the one hand, I think that we have to really be cautious of not making it sound like this is a diversity initiative or a diversity hire. And, you know, as we talked about earlier in the roundtable, that this is just going to be part of the diversity unit, right? And that, you know, this hire is not simply going to be an island, right, in the department that studies everything else but Asian American literature, right? And so, you know, I certainly, you know, also want to, you know, second, third, and fourth, the point that the candidate should really be valued for the work that they do in literature, right, as opposed to the specific contributions that they would make in terms of bringing in Asian American literature to Hopkins per se. But having said that, I do think that this is a really exciting moment at Hopkins, but also at other institutions where we are trying to really think past existing models, you know, that were built on American studies, right, that were very US centric, and that, you know, were really in some ways created not with a lot of thought sometimes, right? It was just kind of an immediate response to student demands, as some of our examples, you know, demonstrated. And, you know, at Hopkins, we've been really thinking more about, rather than creating a separate Asian American studies program, actually creating a more collaborative major, right? Not so much around ethnic studies, but around social justice, right? And we've been in conversation with students and faculty about, you know, how Hopkins can really bring its distinctive kind of interdisciplinary and global approach to examining these questions of racial justice, and, you know, and also to really incorporate anti-racism more on a kind of global scale in terms of thinking through student demands for Asian American studies programs. And I think that that is something that might be really attractive for a candidate, you know, in terms of not asking the candidate to build an Asian American studies program, but more like work collaboratively with other faculty and students to think about what is the right kind of program or major or area of study for this particular moment, you know, when we have global mass demonstrations of anti-racist solidarity and the global expansion of, you know, BLM protests. You know, what is the right tool? What is the right approach to really addressing these concerns? And I think that's really an exciting, you know, endeavor for any candidate to think about and to join an institution that's kind of going through this period of time.
Thank you so much. And Erin, if I could just record what you said and play it for our candidate, that would be so great.
They can watch the webinar.
Yes, that would be, you could show them this webinar.
You can make a little GIF for them.
But thank you so much, Chris, for your question. And I actually wanted to link this with another set of questions that were from the attendees. And Chris, I will, you don't have to stay if you don't want to as a panelist. So one is about whether or not you think institutions should be teaching Asian American studies or studies more focused on the Asian diaspora as a whole. And then another question from Lai Long, who writes that my institution has a strong Asian studies program, but there isn't a single course that addresses the Asian American perspective. While we have started a conversation with our administration, it will be a while before anything concrete happens, if at all. Some of us don't want to wait. We want to try to introduce Asian American perspectives in our Asian studies courses in the meantime. Any suggestions for how to go about it?
Go ahead, Ji-Yeon.
That's a really tough set of questions. So for the first question, I would say you really need to do both. Right? You need to talk about Asian Americans in the domestic U.S. context, as well as in the broader, you know, Americas context. And you need to talk about Asian diaspora as well, because, you know, Asian Americans are part of Asian diaspora. And to really understand cultural production, history, experiences, etc., you have to understand some of the rest of that diaspora as well. You know, Asian studies and Asian American studies seem like they would be good siblings, but actually they're not. And it's because they have different parents. They're actually not siblings, right? So Asian studies comes out of a colonial area studies project. And it really shows, despite all the changes, it shows in the way that Asian studies looks at or doesn't look at race, and the way that Asian studies looks at empire and colonialism. And often, even now, there are parts of Asian studies that doesn't really look at empire or colonialism, right? And that's the real problem. So whether or not an Asian studies department or program can incubate Asian American studies depends completely on who are the faculty in Asian studies at your institution, right? Do they understand race? Do they have some conversation with critical race? Do they understand decolonization and neo-imperialism? Do they take that seriously? Do they understand that, Asian diaspora is not merely just, transplanting pieces of Asia outside of Asia, but it's a completely different kind of transformative sort of process? If they understand that, or in a place where they're able to develop an understanding, then it could be very successful to incubate Asian American studies out of Asian studies, right? And it could be the kind of transnational diaspora-focused Asian American studies program. That could be really great. But if the faculty aren't like that, then it's going to be a problem.
I think that is a really good self-scrutiny to start with. There are also the other routes. I don't know the questioner's exact situation, but there are Asian American Studies colleagues to talk to, right? And I'm glad you've asked us this question, right? You can start with some of the basic readings, but it's hard. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily venture to teach Asian Studies 101, right? So I'm a little hesitant in a way to encourage you to put that pressure on yourself, along with, I'm sure, all your other responsibilities. Can your institution fund some guest lecturing, right? Can your institution fund a guest instructor? Especially with Zoom, like these things aren't hard to set up now, especially the guest lectures. And that might be in some ways the most intellectually responsible way to go about it, to kind of get started, if there are not, if the questioner or their colleagues don't have any training or any expertise. It does really depend, again, like not really knowing kind of the exact background of folks who might be at this institution. But I think also there's something to be said for not just doing all that work and letting your institution off, right? I mean, this is a separate field. They need people to teach it. And I don't think the answer should be that people, particularly, faculty of color, should take that burden on themselves. And also that encourages a kind of perception that like, that's the qualification that's needed, right? That this is all the qualification that is needed to teach that field. So I think that, that kind of advocacy would be my first route in asking for that bit of funding. And I mean, I won't volunteer. I was about to say, I'm sure anybody on this panel would be happy to do it, but I won't volunteer everybody's time and energy. But I think that, Asian American Studies faculty, by and large, are a very community-oriented group and would be really sympathetic to something like this.
So I would add that I agree. And I also want us to step away from having to decide either or. You know, I think that this kind of framing, like, can we have this or this? Why is it that we can't have both? They're very different. Even the question of race is understood very differently in the US at different historical moments, even in this country, than it is in different other, nation states. So I just, it can't be either or, like either I'll teach this or this. The university should be able to fund both, because they are very different. And actually, it's a disservice to our students. It's by not offering a complete curriculum.
I wanted to invite one of our attendees, Cynthia Wu, who posted a question I think is very relevant to this discussion. So Cynthia, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, thank you so much, Erin, and thank you to the other panelists for this amazing discussion. So I had a question some time ago about the recent spate of job ads in Asian American studies. It's a really wonderful year for the field. I've seen so many ads so far. We're also hiring, and there's going to be some stiff competition out there for candidates, which is good for all of us. So I'm curious as to what you make about this recent spate of interest, because it doesn't seem to me that all of the institutions that are hiring out there are really equipped to mentor and support these junior scholars. And I really appreciate Chris having come and asked questions earlier, because he sounds like he's someone who is really doing the right thing when it comes to hiring somebody, retaining them, and making them feel like they are a part of the community. So that's great. But I don't know if everyone out there is on the same page when it comes to doing their due diligence in that way. So yeah, thoughts about that.
Hi, Cindy. So nice to see you. I think that is a really good point. There's little doubt in my mind that the rise of anti-Asian racism and the Atlanta shootings gave a lot of institutions, or probably gave a lot of students and faculty the momentum that they needed to push for something that they'd been pushing for probably for a longer time. So we're seeing this spate of hiring for sad reasons, right? So it's a good thing for the field, and good thing for the students, but for sad reasons. In terms of the poor mentoring, that's nothing new. And I think that the Asian American Studies field will probably pick up that burden as it so often has, right? Because it is very tight-knit and supportive field. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because maybe that's something that the leadership in the field and the senior scholars that we should be keeping a close eye on as all of this kind of surge of hires is happening, that there's going to be maybe more need for those early career mentoring sessions at AAAS and spaces like that. So I think there are things that the fields can do, and I think those are really important. But mentoring as a whole and career development as a whole, I think it's a growing need at institutions, particularly, not exclusively, but I think particularly in the humanities and social sciences. This is a really huge systemic problem, and it falls the hardest on faculty of color, women, LGBTQ scholars who also have all these other service needs. So I think you're pointing to a facet of a really enormous question for the whole field. And I do see some work going on. My own institution has an NSF funded grant specifically looking at this. sponsoring mentoring circles, trying to develop better ways of thinking about this. I don't know what the ultimate impacts will be, but I'm pleased to see that there's real funding and support going to these questions.
Yeah, I'd just like to echo what Heidi said and add just two things. One is that at those institutions that now have those job ads out this fall, that's really the culmination of, in some cases, more than a decade of pushing by students and alumni, right? Like at Yale, Yale's ethnic studies faculty actually had a strike, right? To say that they were not being properly supported and that they needed more faculty, right? At Harvard, Harvard's Asian American Alumni Association has been pushing for Asian American Studies faculty and Asian American Studies program for almost 2 decades now, right? So the pandemic, anti-Asian violence, and the murders in Atlanta were kind of the last public nudge that those institutions needed to be like, okay, fine, we'll hire. Okay? So what does that mean then for mentoring? It means the mentor is going to be hit or miss, probably more like miss. And so Heidi's absolutely right. The field is going to have to step up, right? Otherwise, the junior faculty who are hired are going to have a really difficult time. Right? You know, Harvard and Yale aren't nice to assistant professors anyway. They have even less reason to be nice to Asian American Studies and Ethnic Studies assistant professors. So I think it's something that AAAS, it might be worthwhile for AAAS leadership to really upgrade and revamp its early career mentoring system.
I don't really have much more to add. I mean, I think that it's an exciting time, but it's also a time to be really vigilant about how this will play out in the next few years. And, you know, a lot of that's unknown, right? I think it's the vigilance has to be around making sure that the hires aren't actually serving as Band-Aids, right, for particular issues at the university. Like, oh, we realize we don't have enough Asian American faculty, you know, or Asian bodies here, so let's do this particular hire, or, you know, and Harvard's hire actually, you know, that really began because they're not spending much money. It's actually money that's been raised by alums, right? So it's not actually Harvard's benevolence. It's money from the outside, alums demanding this, you know, that they didn't have when they were there. So I think that, you know, just being hyper aware as we move through the next 5 years will be really important for the field.
Can I just say one thing about this is that, you know, I think perhaps also, I mean, just a question of being vigilant, but vigilant now, because, you know, in the social sciences and humanities, we may be seeing an increased, you know, these hires, multiple hires being advertised. This is happening concomitantly with the China initiative that is still going on in the State Department, and where faculty have been fired. You know, they've been incarcerated because of their supposed relationship to China, because of racial profiling in the sciences. And so, you know, which has a long history here in the United States. So it, you know, I think, you know, if there's been multiple letters. I mean, there's this whole letter campaign that Stanford started, physics department, Princeton, you know, these have to be connected in some way. Like the hiring that is going on in the social sciences and humanities and the so-called value that they're now putting on like Asian American perspectives, that needs to be also matched with universities pushing back on racial profiling in those same universities, you know, in STEM. This is I mean, I think that, you know, this is a way to also bring students in who think that they don't have any kind of relationship to what's going on in the social sciences and humanities, to say that, these things are actually deeply linked, and it's the scholars who are working on these questions that are the ones who are also like, trying to help this people who are essentially being incarcerated because of their supposed race or kind of primordial connection to China, right? So I think also bringing these issues that are happening in our universities, our colleagues, into the frame is also important. And oftentimes we kind of split it off, social science, humanities from STEM, but in this case, I think we need to make the frame the entirety of the university and what United States policy is doing to shape disciplines across the board,
Thank you again, Professor Wu, for joining us with your question.
Thank you.
So we are going to wrap up soon, but I'd like to pose a final question to our panelists about this particular moment. So as I mentioned earlier, the global mass demonstrations of anti-racist solidarity that we've witnessed in this past year have really provided us with unique opportunities for coalition building and taking a global approach to examining and confronting anti-Asian racism. So what do you think are the potential contributions of Asian American studies to this moment? And what do you think is the future of Asian American studies?
I think the field's been grappling with all those questions for a long time, Erin. I think, I feel like ever since the beginning, right? It was this question of what is Asian American studies? What is Asian American studies going to be? Is it a topic? Is it delimited by the boundaries of the nation? Is it more methodological, right? Is it a way of seeing? And I think that despite the constant questioning, Asian American studies is really suited to this moment, partly because it is so grounded in protest. And I think that the field has never really lost that feeling and that dedication to really pushing for social justice. And you really see, leadership in the field now trying to maintain very much that same spirit that came out of the 60s, sometimes in controversial ways, sometimes in ways that not everyone agrees with. You also see them, I think, trying to expand to global issues, right? So for example, AAAS has taken up global issues much more in the last few years than it used to. So those are some of the directions that I see it going. And I think that also, again, just by virtue of this particular and peculiar racial position that Asian Americans have in the United States, this is a moment that, again, Asian American studies is well equipped to discuss as the country is really, in a very fractured way, trying to grapple with the question of what race means and how it's defined. So I would say in some ways, I feel more certain of the field's importance than ever before. And I think that that's also maybe just because I'm so encouraged by my students, right? That there's this rising generation that really demands this knowledge. And I think Ji-Yeon put it so well before when she said, what are the frameworks of knowledge that we need to give our students to meet this moment, but also to live in a better way? And that's really what they want. That is what our students are demanding of us. And I'm really optimistic because I think that out of all my studies, Asian American studies has trained me the best to provide them some of those answers.
The Asian American studies came out of demands for third world studies. And the third world studies came to be known as ethnic studies was not merely a name change. It was really an attempt by the academic establishment to change the whole tenor and purpose of third world studies, right? Ethnic studies comes out of the Chicago School. It's the study of minorities, of ethnicities, right? Of marginalized peoples. That's not what Asian American studies and ethnic studies began as. It began as the study of the people of the global majority, as the new term is, as people who have been formerly colonized, liberated, and were seeking ways to collaborate with each other and create a better world for themselves, right? And so all of those things that Asian American Studies has grappled with, right? Like, are we a topic? Are we a subject? Are we a methodology? What are we? We have been all of those things, right? So I want to go back to, right, like, it's not about, is it this or that? It's both and, right? Multiples, right? Asian American Studies contains multitudes, right? With apologies to whoever said that, a poet. And so you see that in our students, and we see that in the range of communities that Asian American Studies engages, right? Not just Asian American communities, but Asian diaspora communities and other communities of color and other diaspora communities, right? We are engaged with Latinx communities and with African American communities and with indigenous communities, not only in the contemporary moment, but in our history, all going all the way back. And so, more than ever, Asian American Studies is not only relevant, but really necessary for understanding what we're going through now and what kind of a future we might be, groping towards.
So I think my colleagues have said it, so well. I don't really have too much more to add. I do think it's important that as we look forward, that we have a clear understanding of our past, right? But along with that, I would also urge our colleagues in Asian American Studies to look not just back as they look forward, but also look to the sides, and to also, as we think about solidarity and our histories of discrimination and racism, to also be cognizant of being mindful of also including issues of Islamophobia, right? And the South Asian American diaspora, right? Because those are often communities that are overlooked or not always included. And so, that's something that I would also just want to add is we are perfectly positioned to equip our students with different kinds of ways of thinking about some of these tensions. But in our own work, because we're forced by the system to be very specific, right? In our research, we overlook these other questions that are definitely within Asian American Studies.
Well, thank you so much to all three of you, Professor Heidi Kim, Maria Khan, and Ji-Yeon Yuh, and to my colleagues Yumi Kim and Clara Han for this incredibly rich and exciting and incredibly inspiring conversation. I think I got so much out of this, and I hope our attendees did too. So thank you again, and I hope we can continue to have this conversation. So Yumi, if you want to just go ahead and if you wanted to make a few remarks too, right? Oh, you're muted.
No, I just wanted to thank everyone as well, and let the attendees know that the event and all our other events as well are available as recordings on our website, which I've just posted in the chat. So we hope that you will join us for our final CRAAV event for the fall 2021 season. We do have much more coming in the spring, but our final one for this semester will be it's not a formal talk, actually. It's more of a conversation with Professor Dylan Rodriguez from UC Riverside. And we hope that those of you who have joined today and other events as well will come back, because we do plan to thread together the various conversations that we've had in our final event for the fall. So thank you very much.